In the first video of chapter 12, we talked about the origin of money and the origin of banks. And what we learned is that goldsmiths were taking gold from people who were depositing it, and then they were essentially writing out loans or IOUs to people who were borrowing the money. And ultimately what happens is the goldsmiths end up issuing more IOUs than there is gold. Today's banking system is really not too different from that. Our banking system in the U.S. and pretty much all of Earth at this point is based on a fractional reserve system. In a fractional reserve banking system, banks only have to hold a portion of their deposits in their reserves, which allows them to loan out some of the money that they have. Okay? In the U.S., we have specific laws on how much money the banks have to hold. So within this fractional reserve banking system, in the U.S. at least, we have specific laws. The required reserve ratio is the minimum percent of deposits that a bank must hold. And generally speaking, in the U.S., the required reserve rate is 10%. I say generally speaking because there are some specific rules where this number is different if you're a really small bank. This number is different if the money is being saved instead of put into a checking account. But largely speaking, most of the money in banks, the banks have to hold at least 10%. Okay? So this is the required reserve ratio. And what that means is they may loan up to 90% of their deposits. So for example, if BB&T, and this is BB&T, not one branch of BB&T, but the entirety of BB&T, the banking company, if they have $100 million in deposits, they must hold at least $10 million in reserves. Okay? This is going to do some really important stuff. Essentially, this is going to increase the money supply. But to see how that works, we'll hold off and do that in chapter 13. Okay? So that's the fractional reserve banking system. We'll come back to that in chapter 13. But we're going to move on to a different topic now, really an unrelated topic for the most part. And let's think about the types of money that a country could choose to use. There's two types of general money that countries could decide to use. There's commodity money and there's fiat money. Commodity money is money that has intrinsic value. Or in other words, it has value in and of itself. So for example, when we talked about gold and silver being used as money in ancient Europe, or even up until just 100 years ago, that gold and silver is commodity money in that the gold and silver is valuable in and of itself. Nobody has to decide it's valuable, it just is. People want it already. So commodity money is money that has value, okay? Fiat money, on the other hand, is money that has little to no intrinsic value. All right, the money is not worth anything in and of itself. In other words, the money is valuable. It's based purely, its value is based purely on trust in the currency itself. Fiat money, a good example of that is U.S. money, right? U.S. currency. You know, if I show you this 25-cent quarter right here, this isn't worth 25 cents in terms of its metal value. It's worth 25 cents because the government says it's worth 25 cents, and we've trusted that system. Okay, it has value not because of intrinsic value, but because of governmental decree. Okay, so the U.S. has actually had both of these systems through time, and I would say that up until 1971, the U.S. system was largely commodity-based. And the U.S. System is interesting. It's hard to say exactly when it truly switched from commodity to fiat because it was gradual. If you go back 200 years ago, it was almost purely commodity money, meaning people would use coins, gold and silver coins, which are obviously based on their value themselves. So if I'm buying something from someone in 1800 in the U.S., I pay with a gold coin. It's gold. It has value in and of itself. So the fact that the U.S. says it's worth something is meaningless. It's valuable because it's gold. If you go to, say, 1950, we had a mixed system. We had commodity money in the sense that quarters and dimes were made of silver. But we had a fiat system because we had a lot of paper money too. So it was kind of a mixed system. In 1971, this is when we completely switched to fiat money. We dropped all silver coins. Starting in 1964, we got rid of quarters and dimes. In 1970, we got rid of half dollars being silver. And by 1971, we dropped all ties to gold and silver. So up until 1971, the U.S. system had some commodity components to it. Today, it's purely fiat. And so what I want to do now is think about the advantages and disadvantages of having commodity or fiat money. So let me erase this. And let's do a quick little side-by-side comparison. On the left, we'll think about the advantages with fiat money. And on the right, let's think about the advantages of commodity money. And of course, the advantages of commodity money are also the disadvantages of fiat money, right? If it's here, that means fiat money is not getting to take advantage of those benefits. Let's start actually with commodity money. Since commodity money is something you would have seen 100 years ago in most, in pretty much all over the globe, let's start there and then move our way towards what is more common now in the present, fiat money. The biggest advantage of commodity money is that it doesn't require trust in the currency. So its value will never go away. For example, if we're using gold or silver as currency, and let's say in the U.S., if we're using gold and silver as currency, if the U.S. completely falls apart, our gold and silver is still going to work. Our currency that we're using in the U.S. would still function because it's commodity money. On the other hand, if you have fiat money, if everybody stopped trusting it, it would fall apart. Or if the U.S. dissolved, the money that you have would become worthless. So commodity money is advantageous in the sense that the currency is inherently valuable, so it's always going to be valuable to the individuals. Okay? That's really the biggest benefit of commodity money, is that it will always hold its value, and to kind of extrapolate from that, hyperinflation is probably impossible, right? If we're talking about gold or silver, hyperinflation is impossible because gold and silver isn't going to suddenly lose tremendous value. So it's pretty much impossible, okay? So people automatically trust it. You're not going to get any hyperinflation. That's probably the only two major advantages I can think with commodity money. On the other hand, fiat money has advantages too. One is that it's much cheaper to produce. Fiat money is much cheaper to produce, meaning if you want to make a $20 gold coin, it's going to cost more than $20 to do so. the gold itself is going to cost $20, and then to shape it into a coin is going to cost a little bit of money too. So what that would mean is if you're producing a $20 commodity coin, you would actually lose profits. The government would actually lose money by creating that coin. On the other hand, the Federal Reserve in the United States can produce a $20 bill for just a few cents, right? If it's producing a $20 bill, it's just paper. It's very cheap to do so. This allows for something called seigniorage, which is a key term I want you to know. I don't think this is in the book. Seigniorage is the profits generated by producing fiat money. So if our Federal Reserve produces a $100 bill and it only costs them 3 cents to do so, they've made a $99.97 profit. And the Federal Reserve turns that profit over to the federal government. So basically this helps us pay off some of our debt. It's called seigniorage. It's an economic-oriented term that you probably won't hear anywhere else, to be honest. So it's much cheaper produced. That's a benefit of fiat money. It's much easier to control. All right, the government has the ability to control its value. If you think about commodity money, gold's value is going to be based on the free market for gold. So it could go up or down. Fiat money can be controlled. You can print more money, you can destroy money to change the value. So what this allows us to do is engage in something we haven't talked about at all yet, monetary policy, which is what we'll cover in Chapter 13. Monetary policy is the adjusting of the money supply in order to change things like inflation rates or interest rates. So monetary policy is another way the government or the Federal Reserve, in our case in the U.S., can influence the overall economy. You can't really do that with commodity money. The amount of gold on Earth is fixed. So increasing the amount of gold is impossible past some certain number. Decreasing the amount of gold is also kind of tough. It's hard to get rid of it because it can always just flow in from other countries. But in terms of fiat money, the Federal Reserve is the only organization that can produce U.S. cash. So money can't come from other countries randomly or unexpectedly. Okay? So it's much easier to control. That's another big advantage of fiat money, allowing us to do some monetary policy. Okay? And I'm just going to add to this, this allows us to target inflation rates. All right? One advantage of commodity money is you're not going to have any hyperinflation, but a big disadvantage is you could have deflation. Certainly the value of gold could go up, which would be deflation. If you're controlling the money supply, that shouldn't happen with fiat money. And I think that's really getting at the biggest advantages of each. We could certainly go into a lot more advantages with fiat money, but the two big ones are it's much easier to produce, it's cheap, and it's much easier to control. Basically, if fiat money is run well, right? If fiat money is run well, it's better. It's better because you get these advantages, okay? And if it's run well, you shouldn't have hyperinflation anyway, and people should trust it anyway, okay? The concern is what if you do fiat money poorly? Well, that's what happened in Zimbabwe, and that led to hyperinflation. People didn't trust the monetary system anymore. So fiat money is best if you're able to control it. In this chapter, we've talked about commodity versus fiat money. And we began the chapter by thinking about going back to the origins of money and the origins of banking, and leading that up to thinking about the U.S. and its system with commodity and then fiat money. There's just one last thing I want to do, and that's to ask the question, how much money is there in the U.S.? This is actually a pretty interesting question. You might think just count up all the money, meaning just count up the number of cash dollars and cents, or ask the Federal Reserve, how much money have you printed? That doesn't work, okay? To illustrate why that's the case, think about how much money you have. Ask yourself, how much money do you have? This is something I ask myself all the time. How much money do I have? And the answer is, it depends on what you consider money. In terms of cash and coins, I don't have much money at all. Most of my money is in checking accounts, retirement accounts, savings accounts, stocks. You know, my money is not held in cash or coins. So this is an interesting question because it depends on what you consider money. As we said before, you know, money must satisfy the three criteria of being a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. But even after using those three criteria, some things can be a little sketchy. For example, savings accounts. Is that money? You usually can't spend money out of savings accounts right away. It takes a little bit of time. And there may be rules about how often you can withdraw money from a savings account. It's kind of interesting to think about. But one way to further analyze whether something should truly be considered money is to think about liquidity. All right? Liquidity refers to something very specific in economics. Liquidity, all right, I'm going to stick with that term. Liquidity being the noun version, liquid being the adjective. Liquidity refers to how easily something can be spent or alternatively, you'll sometimes see this defined as how easily something can be turned into cash. Everything, there's lots of things that have value, right? But what determines whether or not they operate like money has to do with liquidity. So, for example, an iPhone has value, and it's not especially liquid. Meaning, if I have an iPhone that's worth $400, it may take me a few days to turn that iPhone into $400 cash. So it's not very liquid. A house may be worth $300,000, but it's very illiquid. If you wanted to sell that house for $300,000, probably take you at least a couple of months to do so. So some things are more liquid than others. A savings account takes a little bit of time to spend, but it's still quite liquid, okay? So the things that are very liquid, like cash and coins, are definitely money. Things like houses aren't very liquid, never really consider that money in the true sense. So we actually have two measures to calculate how much money is in society. Those two measures are M1 and M2. That's just what we've decided to call them. There's also an M3, but it used to be something we paid attention to, M3. It's kind of lost attention from economists. So M1 and M2 is the only thing in the book, and that's the only thing I'm going to talk about in regards to calculating the money supply. So M1 is a measure of the money supply that includes only very liquid versions of money. Only stuff you can spend very quickly, okay? So what can you spend very quickly? If you want to buy something, what method would be very fast? Well, if you use currency, that's going to be very quick, right? Cash and coins can be very quick. I can go downtown right now, spend it right away. I can't go downtown and spend my iPhone right away, right? It would take time. But I can take cash and coins and buy something pretty much instantly. Likewise, my checking account, very liquid. To spend money out of my checking account, I can go to the ATM and withdraw some cash and spend it. Or I can go online and purchase stuff directly from my checking account. Or I can use my debit card. These are all really quick ways to spend money with my checking accounts. Okay? Furthermore, you might be wondering, well, what about credit cards? Well, when you pay with credit cards, how do you pay the money back? Almost certainly you do so through a checking account. So checking accounts are very liquid, and when you're buying something with a credit card, it's really the checking account that you're spending. Okay? So this is another very liquid item. And then a third item, which I don't even think I'm going to define, is something called a traveler's check. Traveler's checks are something that you can travel around with and spend sort of like money. Traditionally, the reason you'd use a traveler's check is, for example, let's say you're flying to France and you don't want to take a bunch of money with you. You might instead go to Western Union or go to your bank and ask to get some traveler's checks. Turn the cash in to get some traveler's checks, and the benefit of these traveler's checks is that you can write specific amounts for purchases. So I can say, just like you'd write a regular personal check, you might say you want to spend $100, and you can write it and spend it, and it'll be accepted throughout the United States. It's legal tender just like regular cash. Traveler's checks, not a big deal anymore. People don't use these very often, but it's still included in M1, so I'm going to have to put it up here, even though it's probably not all that important. So that's M1. All of these things are very easy to spend, okay? Cash, super easy to spend. Checking accounts, super easy to spend. And traveler's checks, if you owe someone money, they actually legally have to accept traveler's checks. So it's also very easy to spend because you can pay any debts with it. So that's M1. M2 is a broader measure of the money supply. So it basically includes stuff that's not so liquid, all right? Just to be clear here, if we're thinking about M2, M2 includes everything in M1, all right? So if this is M1, M2 is just a broader measure of the money supply. It includes all of M1 plus some other stuff that's not so liquid. So it includes the following. One is M1. Cash and coins, all right, currency, checking accounts, and traveler's checks. That's the first thing that's in M2 because M2 is basically saying, let's be a little more lax with our definition. Let's include all of this, but let's add some stuff to it. Okay? So it's got everything in M1. It's also got savings accounts. If you're watching this video, there's probably about a 60 or 70% chance that you yourself have a savings account. Savings accounts aren't as liquid as checking accounts because you usually can't just use your debit card to make purchases with your savings accounts. And sometimes they have rules like you can only withdraw, once a week or something, or you have to come into the bank to get the cash. They're just not quite as liquid. In some instances, it may be just as simple as savings accounts. In order to access this money, you've got to transfer it into checking, and then you can withdraw it. All right? That's a quick thing that you can do, but it still takes a couple seconds longer than spending money out of a checking account. So this is simply not quite as liquid. It's harder to spend. Okay? So M2 includes M1, savings accounts, a kind of vague category, small time deposits, as the book puts it. These are things like CDs, certificates of deposits. So things like certificates of deposits would fall into this realm. Maybe you know what a CD is, but just in case you don't, a certificate of deposit works this way. Let's say I've got $1,000 and I don't want to put it in checking because I'm not going to get any interest out of it. I don't want to put it in savings either because it's only giving, a tiny little bit of interest. So I'm looking around for something. I could put it in stocks, but that's not so safe. What I might decide to do is put my money into a CD, okay, a certificate of deposit. In a CD, your money gains predetermined interest, and is paid back at a predetermined date. Nothing fancy about it at all. But it's usually going to give you a higher interest rate than, say, savings or checking. And it's not very risky. In fact, there's essentially no risk with most CDs. So basically, I could do this right now. I could walk down to the bank and buy a CD. It wouldn't take me very long to do it, right? Sign the paperwork, and I'd be done. So what I might do is say, I want you to hold my $1,000 in a CD. I'm not going to be able to get it out, all right? That money is away from me for the time being. But I might set it up so that 3 months from now, I can go get that $1,000 back plus some interest. Beneficial to me because I get interest. Beneficial to the bank because they can do whatever they want with that $1,000 while it's gone. And they know I can't go and get it back, right? If I put my money in a checking account, I can come back and get it at any point, and they got to hold at least 10%. Banks don't have to hold any of that CD. They can do whatever they want with it. All right? So small time deposits refers to things like this, like these CDs, and the small time refers to, this only includes CDs that have a short window. I think it's 3 months or less. So for example, you can buy a 30-year CD where you get paid 30 years from now. That is really illiquid, right? It's not liquid at all. If I'm not going to get my money until 30 years from now, it's very hard to spend that money today. But CDs are pretty liquid because I know I'm going to get them in the future, so I can spend them pretty soon. And furthermore, the fact that I know I'm going to get my money, say, in just a month, will allow me to spend the money I have currently more freely because I know that money is coming in. So even if I can't access that money today, the fact that I know it's coming makes me spend more of the current money that I have. So it ends up operating a lot like money in that way. All right, so M2 includes M1, savings accounts, small time deposits, and just one last thing, money market mutual funds. Money market mutual funds is a big category of money. There's a lot of money in these. In fact, there's more money in this one than all the other categories. You probably have money in one of these, but you don't know it. These are accounts where money is invested in very safe instruments, okay? That's the terminology we use in finance. So very safe instruments. So invested in things like governmental bonds, very safe corporate bonds, business bonds. So for example, Apple may need to borrow some money, and it might do so by getting people to invest in a money market mutual fund. So accounts where money is invested in very safe instruments and the money is quickly accessible. So it's not locked into some sort of time commitment like you have with the CD, okay? So do you have a money market mutual fund? You probably do. Let me give you an example. If you have any money in PayPal, then that money is going to be invested in a money market mutual fund. So when you put your money in PayPal, now PayPal has your money. They don't want to just sit there with it. That's not good for you or them. So they'll invest it in one of these money market mutual funds. This is a good choice because money market mutual funds are really safe, but they generate some interest. So it's better than just leaving it there, okay? So if you have your money in PayPal, it's going to be invested. If you're thinking about buying some stocks and you might put your money into, say, TD Ameritrade, before you invest it, your money's just sitting there. Well, it's sitting in a money market mutual fund, earning some interest. If you put your money in just about anything and you're going to have a chance to get it back in the future, it's probably going to be invested. So if you put your money in, say, DraftKings, fantasy football site, your money's not going to sit there. It's probably going to be invested in a money market mutual fund. And maybe you don't get the interest. Maybe DraftKings gets it. But the bottom line is the money ends up in the money market mutual fund. So there are lots of these. Businesses put money in them. They're safe. They earn a little bit of interest. You probably have some money in it, whether or not you realize it. These are actually really common, and there's a tremendous amount of money in these. They certainly fall into the category of M2 because they're not as easy to spend as, say, a checking account. If I want to get my money out of DraftKings, it may take a couple of hours or maybe a few days. But that's still pretty daggum liquid, right? I can still get it pretty quickly. So that's M2. So how much money is in both of these categories? Well, in M1, all right, and this is, I didn't gather the data today, so I don't know exactly what this is, but there's about 4 trillion in M1, and there's about 14 trillion in M2. Which of these is correct? Well, it depends on which one you want to use. It depends on how you want to measure the money supply. Neither of these is right or wrong. It's just different ways to think about how much money is out there. Now, why does it matter? It matters. It's a good question for me to ask. So I'm going to make sure I write this down. Why does this matter? What if the Federal Reserve, who we're about to get into in Chapter 13, what if the Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply by 1%? What if the Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply by 1%? Maybe they're thinking if we do this, it will generate 1% inflation. Well, if you want to increase the money supply by 1%, you better know how much money there is to begin with, right? So in this case, if you're trying to target M1 and raise it by 1%, that would mean you need to raise this by $40 billion. So knowing how much money is in M1 and M2 is crucial for doing effective monetary policy. So this is an important thing for us to be capable of doing, okay? Furthermore, when money supply goes up or goes down, that can have impacts on the economy, so we need to know if it's going up or down. The thing is, the amount of money can change, right? This is a more complicated thing in economics, but if I take my 10 grand, let's say I've got 10 grand sitting at home in cash and coins. Well, that's 10 grand in money, okay? But if I take it to the bank and I've got 10 grand in a checking account, that's still, I'm going to view that as my money, but somebody else is going to be spending it. So 10 million, that $10,000 is still going to be used by me, but it's also going to be used by someone else. So when people take their money to the bank, the money supply actually goes up. If they take it out of the bank, the money supply actually goes down. So the money supply, see, can change. So we need to constantly be measuring it so we know what's happening with the money supply in order to avoid problems like deflation or hyperinflation or interest rates that are out of whack. And in Chapter 13, we're going to talk a lot about that. All right, that's the end of Chapter 12. This is kind of a strange chapter because there's not much math. It's more content-based, so be prepared for some short answer questions on the exam.